Our new sector was in the Forêt de Champs, southwest of Saint-Dié. Our mission was to prevent American access to the road junction in Corsieux. In the area of the nearby small town of Vannemont, there was very heavy fighting with the Japanese, who tenaciously attacked over and over again. Our Lancers were rather shocked and bitter. "The Japanese are our allies, aren't they?" they asked. "Are they, too, fighting us now?" In a narrow valley, German units had encircled a battalion that came from Texas. The Hawaiian Japanese of the 442nd Infantry Regiment had been ordered to get them out of there at any cost. It meant bad business for the Americans. To get about 300 Texans freed, some 800 Japanese were killed or wounded. A report about this fighting, in which mostly our division was involved, appeared in Reader's Digest in 1960. After these battles, I was informed that the Personnel Office had named a new commander for Grenadier Regiment 308. My Oberst, the previous regimental commander, was named commander of the Salzburg-Berchtesgaden Security District. Before he departed, he informed me that I had been recommended for the Knight's Cross by General der Flieger Petersen. I could only think of how Papa Schulz had been recommended for the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross before he was replaced in Russia. Maybe I had contributed to this relief by my sometimes quite unorthodox behaviour. If the division commander had insisted on retaining me as a regimental commander, he would have succeeded. General Major Schiele was fairly new, though, and did not know me very well. Besides, I had spent much of the last 2 months actually under the command of another division. Additionally, his official expert for personnel was not my special friend, which I would understand only much later. The appearance of a successor, who was senior to me and had also completed a course for regimental commanders, was probably a special grace of fate for me. Once, in 1943, I had interfered with my fate and then made up my mind never to do it again. One of the battalion commanders, whom I personally knew well and valued a lot, became successor to Oberst Kaiser in Grenadier Regiment 326, but only lasted a few weeks before being killed in action. My successor, too, led the regiment only for a few weeks before being interned in Switzerland. After I relinquished command, the division considered giving me command of the Division Fusilier Battalion. This was a fairly elite unit, which was used for reconnaissance, screening and other light infantry duties. I assume that some gentlemen higher up did not agree with my assignment to command this unit. General Petersen, as well as the commanding general of 19th Army, General de Infanterie Wiese, had not forgotten my 6 weeks of defending Le Thillot, the gateway to the Busang Tunnel. I was destined for further regimental commands. In position on the Schlucht Pass, an equally important location, was a mixed unit the size of a regiment, made up of volunteers including Azerbaijanis and Germans. The incumbent regimental commander was an older Oberstleutnant who was obviously tired of the war. I was ordered to take over his command. Thus began my last combatant assignment of World War I. I inherited a regimental staff consisting of men mostly older than I. One of the messengers had been an actor before the war, another was an opera singer, and so forth. As a driver and orderly, I got a Bavarian freight hauler, my loyal Joseph, with whom I enjoyed 30 years of dear friendship after the war. I visited him and his family quite often in his lower Bavarian homeland. He had a kind-hearted Austrian wife, who was his genuine life partner, staying by his side through better and worse until his death. Nevertheless, from a military point of view, over the next 3 weeks, I experienced confusion and disorganization that was unbelievable. Only a few days after assuming responsibility for the defense of the Col de la Schlucht, my staff and I were ordered to the southern edge of the Vosges Mountains. The 1st French Armoured Division and the 9th Colonial Division had broken through south of Belfort and reached the Rhine along the Swiss border. I assumed command of Grenadier Regiment 490, which, together with other units, was deployed southeast of Belfort to protect the southern flank of the 19th Army. The local commander was General Major Rudolf von Oppen, a quite courageous gentleman, who was especially candid when expressing his opinion. "You know, my dear Gross-Johann," he said during our short orientation talk, "some time ago I was invited to meet Herr Himmler. Actually, he is quite a nice guy. It's unimaginable how much blood is stuck on his fins." He really said fins. My command post was in Brebot, about 11 kilometres southeast of Belfort, just on the southeast bank of the Rhine-Rhône Canal. Late on the afternoon of the 19th of November, French tanks attacked in great numbers from the woods to the south, and we had nothing with which to oppose them. The only chance of saving the soldiers of Grenadier Regiment 490, who were entrusted to me for a short time, from the tanks was to use the canal a few hundred metres behind us as an obstacle. I ordered a withdrawal behind this natural tank barrier during nightfall. Naturally, I asked no one for permission. This time there really was no opportunity to do so. The mission to protect the southern flank of the 19th Army could be accomplished from behind the canal as well as, or even better than, from before it. The next morning, General von Oppen called to tell me that 2 gentlemen from the staff of Army headquarters wanted to interrogate me at noon because of my evasion behind the canal. But personally, the General agreed fully with my decision. Towards noon, I appeared, as ordered, at the General's command post, where the 2 gentlemen were already expecting me. One was an Oberstleutnant IG, the other a judge advocate. I described the previous evening's situation to them and explained that the enemy attacked with about the same number of tanks as I had infantrymen. Besides that, we had no armour-piercing weapons at our disposal. Then I told them quite briefly about my experiences during the first weeks in Le Thillot, where I was also left alone with my fate. I explained that I had been in the business long enough to have learned that these days one could rely on one's own judgment as a soldier. The 2 gentlemen were quickly convinced and assured me that, based on statements by the General, they would not raise any complaints against me. With this, the case was dismissed. The same day, Grenadier Regiment 490 was attached to the 198th Infantry Division, which had been moved here to the south to defend against a French penetration of the Belfort Gap and subsequent breakout onto the plain of Alsace. This would not have been possible had I not brought it to safety behind the canal the night before. As mentioned, it was again almost the same situation as in Le Thillot, which also could only be defended because I did not execute a senseless order. The regiments of the 198th Infantry Division on my eastern and western flanks lagged behind, but my old bunch in Grenadier Regiment 308 followed me as my regiment advanced until we reached the Swiss border in the foggy darkness. Of course, I did have a great advantage with the support of the Jagdpanther battalion, but my leading infantry battalion, attacking along the road, nevertheless sustained considerable losses at the hands of the French, who tenaciously defended the cemetery in Souasse. Ultimately, in the course of the next few days of battle, my old regiment, to which I had belonged for almost 4 years, became more and more compressed into a small area near the Swiss border. They were finally faced with 2 choices: internment in Switzerland or being taken prisoner by the French. Understandably, they preferred the former option. General von Horn, our former division commander from Russia, who by now was the German military attaché in Switzerland, of course took special care of his former regiment as far as it was possible. In the evening hours of the 21st of November, I was wounded in my left hand by a small shell fragment. The splinter penetrated my thumb, causing such severe pain that, together with great fatigue, I became quite sick. Early the next morning, I was operated on at a dressing station and then returned to my outfit. Grenadier Regiment 490, which I was leading until then, left the control of the 198th Division the same night and returned to its 269th Division. For me, it meant the final departure from my old division. Thereafter, I again took charge of my job at the Schlucht Pass. The next 2 to 3 weeks went by relatively calmly, at least for us in the pass. The early start of winter, most of all the heavy snowfall, created a situation in the high Vosges mountains. Schlucht Pass is 1150 metres above sea level, which made any fighting seem almost impossible. Nevertheless, the French succeeded, after hours of difficult marching through drifting snow and dense fog, in surprising and defeating the weak German position on the 1,360-metre-high Honeck, the highest peak of the Vosges mountains. The peak was not in my sector, but in that of our neighbour to the south, the 269th Division, to which I was actually subordinate. Herr Borsche reported about this event in his booklet, Final Battle in the Vosges Mountains, very explicitly and quite dramatically. The German infantry on the Honeck could only have been surprised because they rather thoughtlessly relied on the belief that in this weather they did not have to expect an attack. Unfortunately, they were wrong. The loss of Honeck, which in good weather provided an excellent view into the Rhine Valley, not only hit the 269th Infantry Division, the 63rd Corps and the 19th Army like a bomb, it also deeply disturbed Herr Himmler in Triberg. Himmler, highly excited, demanded an immediate restoration of the position, as it was called so nicely in such cases. This was not without reason, as it soon became clear. What the enemy achieved at Honeck, he tried again a few days later at the 1,300-metre-high Rheinkopf, 5 kilometres further southwest, and was only denied a similar success with heavy sacrifices on the part of the German forces there. My unit was put on highest alert. Pioneers of the 269th Division succeeded little by little in laying and tightening up a belt of mines between the French at Honeck and their command post, which was established about 1 kilometre west of Honeck in a chalet off the mountain road. On the evening of the 11th of December, I had a conversation with General Wagner, who expressed great concern about the fact that until now all attempts to regain Honeck had failed, including an attack just that day. German troops had surrounded the enemy, but they would not budge. In a mood swing, I declared, "Herr General, I'll go to the Honeck and try to talk the French into a pullout." After that, my officers and I celebrated this somewhat insane decision so extensively that the next morning we were not exactly in great shape. But we still upheld our decision, which by now could not be reversed anyway. Remarkably, though Himmler was usually strictly against any contact with the enemy, as earlier in Le Thillot, he was at once willing to give me his strongest encouragement. My companions and I had to take appropriate credentials with us to Honeck to establish ourselves as negotiators. Capitaine Lartigau, commander of the 1st Company of the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division's 4th Regiment of Tunisian Tirailleurs, and also on-site commander at Honeck, turned us down. He declared that he couldn't even make such a decision. We then marched to his battalion's command post to see if we could reason with them. Regrettably, I only learned of the earlier mentioned minefield at this time. During the march through knee-deep snow to the French battalion's command post, several French soldiers who accompanied us unfortunately lost legs. I was afraid that these fanatic North Africans would hold us responsible and kill us right there. It may have been the presence of a French officer that stopped them from doing it. As expected, despite my entreaties to recognize the hopelessness of their situation, the officers of the battalion staff rejected our offer also. One French major, born in Lorraine, proved himself to be especially spiteful. Perhaps the major, coming as he did from a province that had belonged to Germany from 1870 to 1918, felt he had to affect ardent patriotism in front of his comrades. What impressed me more than the obstinate attitude of the French, however, was their equipment and weapons. The build-up of arms just to protect the immediate vicinity of their command post was of a scale that for us at this stage of the war was only a dream. They also had superior winter clothing, rations and so forth. All was of the best quality and in abundance. The rich brother-in-arms from overseas was, by God, not stingy. When I returned, I could at least give Hauptmann Koch, the battalion commander charged with the mission of pushing the French off the Honeck, quite an accurate description of the place, because the French had not blindfolded us en route. After all, it may hardly have been possible to lead us through knee-deep snow over a distance of 1,000 metres while wearing blindfolds. After I reported the failure of my mission to General-Lieutenant Wagner on the phone, I returned to my command post via Route 417. There were 2 German 88mm flak guns placed on one of those narrow hairpin turns off the pass road. When I passed them, the weather had changed, and Honeck was sharply silhouetted against the sky. I asked the section commander to take advantage of this opportunity, and both guns opened fire against the hotel on top of that fiercely fought-over mountain, less than 4 kilometres away. The next day, the 12th of December, a mixed assault unit, made up from infantry and pioneers led by Hauptmann Koch, attacked Honeck again, and this time they were lucky. The hotel, already badly damaged by continuous fire, was now completely flattened by sticky bombs and bazookas. The French lost 40 killed, 23 wounded, and about 120 prisoners. Hauptmann Koch's task force wound up with 4 killed and 30 wounded. I had tried everything to induce the French to evacuate Honeck. In vain. The price they paid for their inflexible attitude was too high in view of the whole situation. A few weeks later, Honeck would have fallen into their hands without a fight. There were praise and decorations for the brave assault force. Hauptmann Koch received the Knight's Cross. My adjutant and I had a chance to speak with the French prisoners the same day. Regrettably, they had not believed me when I told them that we would level the place the next day and assumed that my visit with them was only bluff. C'est la guerre. A few items mentioned in the booklet about the final battle in the Vosges Mountains need to be corrected. The author writes that I was the chief commander of the assault team. This would have been flattering for me, but it simply does not conform to the facts. I had nothing to do with the successful assault in the end. The commander of this difficult undertaking, which resulted in heavy losses for both sides, was solely Hauptmann Koch. On the 28th of December, I had to report to the commanding general of the 63 Corps, General-Lieutenant Erich Abraham, to receive from him the Knight's Cross. He car-eyed this out in a very humorous manner, with the words, "Now the young man has the proper suit." Afterwards, the general accompanied me to my command post, where we spent a very pleasant half-hour together. After the war, General-Lieutenant Abraham lived in Wiesbaden, where the obviously multi-talented soldier first earned his bread as violinist in a cafe. Unfortunately, I did not have the chance to see him after the war. He died in 1971 in Wiesbaden. Incidentally, the wording for the proposal for my Knight's Cross originated from the pen of a reserve officer who in civilian life was an attorney. He concluded his proposal with the words, "Under any circumstance, with his humour, his harshness toward himself, and his overpowering energy, he was always on top of the situation." From this language, one could almost come to the conclusion that this Bavarian barrister must also have been a successful defence counsel. During Christmas, I was with my provisional unit at the Schlucht Pass in the High Vosges. At that time, I had a brief encounter with our army group commander, Heinrich Himmler. He was not the radiant person that Hitler was. He acted like a petty bourgeois, just as General von Oppen once described. After the war, incidentally, I also got to know Himmler's brother, a schoolmaster in Munich, who was a quiet, amiable fellow. My last action on the front was January 1945, at the legendary Hartmannsweiler Kopf, whose soil was literally soaked with blood from German and French soldiers in 1914 during World War I. By about the middle of the month, I received news that the new commanding general of the 19th Army, General der Infanterie Siegfried Rasp, had granted me a 21-day furlough for bravery. The night before my departure, I was invited by him for dinner. The next morning I was relieved, and my loyal Joseph drove me to 19th Army headquarters. I reported to the commander of the staff quarters, an older cavalry hauptmann, who in civilian life was the owner of a freight hauling company known throughout the Reich. During a conversation with this entrepreneur, I learned, regrettably, not too many positive stories about our new army commander. For a minute reason, he once yelled at the hauptmann, "You white-haired rear echelon staff pigs belong at the front." The adjutant, Oberstleutnant von Arnsberg, formerly of Cavalry Regiment 14 in Ludwigslust, consoled the enraged officer by advising him to consider this unjustified outburst as the rantings of a drunkard, and not as a remark of his chief commander. In the evening, when I marched to the station of the staff quarters, I was not quite sober anymore. When I therefore apologized to Herr von Arnsberg, he uttered quickly and dryly, "This isn't noticeable here. The commanding general is full every night." He actually expressed himself yet a bit more drastically than that. The dinner took less than half an hour. Then I could return to my quarters, supplied with a pass for leave. The new army commander had replaced General der Infanterie Friedrich Wiese, a Schleswiger who had served in the Hamburg police after combat in World War I. Himmler had him fired in the manner of his lord and master, as a scapegoat was needed for the forthcoming end of the 19th Army in the Vosges Mountains. General de Infanterie Raspe was chosen as the replacement. He had commanded the 335th Infantry Division in the east, and also the 78th Infantry Division. One always expects true miracles of people who at some time had previously enjoyed success. General Raspe was an officer of the General Staff and of the same age group as Jodl, Speidel and Husinger. Of course, he couldn't change anything regarding the situation in the Vosges Mountains either. The next morning, my faithful Joseph took me to Freiburg im Breisgau, from whence I started my trip eastward. At this point in time, it was already clear that I could not travel home to East Prussia. I took a long break in Berlin, though. A nurse I knew from Russia managed to get a room for me for an overnight stay near the Friedrichstrasse railroad station. In 1943, when I went to the east for the second time, she and I were in the same train compartment, and from then on I had her home address. She was a young woman who didn't really fit into the scene of those days. As a 17-year-old, she, the daughter of a Prussian government official, became pregnant. The father of the child was a Zollfender in the Navy. It all happened when she and the family's maid secretly visited a dance party for servicemen. Her mother, whom I got to know in Berlin, was a very resolute, realistic and practical lady, as one often meets in those circles. She energetically discouraged her daughter's plans to marry the Navy man. The mother led her daughter through the elegant family home, explaining to her, "This is the ambience in which you grew up. Do you want to spend the rest of your life in a two-room apartment among the petty bourgeois?" The daughter realized that she probably would not want to put up with this, and abandoned the idea of marriage. Her child, a little girl, had been evacuated from Berlin to Silesia, but everybody was now quite worried if they would see her again in good health. The Russians were almost there. On the same day, I received a lesson about how good manners among officers had changed in those days. I had just sat down at the table in a coffee house near the Friedrichstrasse railroad station when an army patrol, commanded by a Hauptmann, appeared to inspect the papers of all the soldiers present. The demeanour with which this officer requested my paybook was extremely close to the line between brevity and insubordination. One could really sense the gratification this armchair warrior enjoyed by bothering a bearer of the Knight's Cross. Unfortunately for me, he even found a reason to further harass me, because my paybook did not include the entry confirming the award of the Knight's Cross. Since I knew that a certain General-Lieutenant Victor Linnars from the Personnel Office signed my temporary proof of ownership, I suggested that the Inquisitor call that office. When I asked him if he would believe that a soldier wearing the German cross in gold and with a leave pass in his pocket personally signed by his army commander would feel the necessity to decorate himself with the Knight's Cross, he simply shrugged his shoulders. He demanded that I come with him to his guard post, which I declined to do. I explained that I had to drive out to Dahlem anyway, where I left my luggage, and in which there would be the certificate of award. So the whole army patrol accompanied me to Dahlem, which, as a two-way trip, certainly took more than 2 hours. In the presence of my rather apprehensive acquaintance, I dug the certificate out of my rucksack and held it under the nose of the chain dog, who was evidently disappointed. He muttered an apology, combined with the reproach that I should not have failed to get the appropriate entry in the paybook. At the end of my rope with this nonsense, I reminded him that barely 72 hours before, at Hartmannsweiler Kopf, I had problems of quite a different kind than checking to ensure all the necessary entries in my paybook had been made. Since I assumed that my family succeeded in their escape from East Prussia, I supposed that they found refuge with some friends in Königsberg in Neumark. As it happened, I was right. Only 1 day later, I took my family to Ludwigslust, where at least I knew a few people. The local mayor arranged for them to be moved into the beautiful home of Countess Voss. Later, when the Russians had moved into Ludwigslust, my family went on towards the west and then lived in the vicinity of Hamelmeter in Westphalia. Soon enough, I returned to the Western Front. During my leave, the 19th Army had, after heavy fighting, abandoned the bridgehead in Alsace. My former division commander in the 198th, General Major Schiele, was meanwhile also sent into the desert as a scapegoat. He obviously did not succeed in working miracles. In his place, Oberst Bard took command of what was left of the division. As a general major, he was killed in action a few days before the war's end. Himmler, too, had disappeared, leaving Army Group Oberrhein on the 24th of January. After his failure on the Upper Rhine, he tried to earn his spurs on the Eastern Front as commander of Army Group Vistula. A short time later, supposedly because of work-related overstrain, Himmler was replaced in that position by one of my former East Prussian commanders, the now Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrichi. During my return trip from Ludwigslust to Freiburg im Breisgau, I contracted a cold with a high fever and was taken to the army hospital in Freiburg. I had asked that Oberstleutnant von Arnsberg be informed that I had finished my leave, but that at this time I was in the hospital. In the meantime, the 19th Army had moved their headquarters to Waldkirch, northeast of Freiburg. A few days later, a few members of my regimental staff from the Schlucht Pass appeared. Their fate was up in the air, and they were hoping that with a new position for me, we would all be able to stay together. Despite some concerns, my physician let me go, and my men could take me with them. They were quartered in a small hamlet in the Clotter Valley for the time being. On one of the following days, I drove to Waldkirch to report back to the army from my little enjoyable leave. Since I had been selected for a course for regimental commanders and had to react on short notice for my enrollment, Oberstleutnant von Arnsberg suggested sending me in the meantime to the military school in Furtwangen. I was allowed a few days of rest, but then had to leave my staff, which had grown so dear to me. For these men it meant being split up, and according to their capabilities, being used in different units. At least I was able to keep one man with me, my trusty Joseph. Ultimately, I kept him until the end of the war. Technically, still being a regimental commander, I could bring about the necessary transfer, which was signed by my adjutant. The commander of the military school, Oberst Müller-Melan, was an old acquaintance. In 1940, he was a major and battalion commander in Regiment Neueger in Ludwigslust. Another long-time acquaintance was my former Oberfeldwebel Braun from 198th Division. He had been promoted to lieutenant for outstanding bravery and was awarded the Oak Leaf Cluster to the Knight's Cross. Together, we trained future company commanders. The practical part, like the handling of machine guns, assault rifles and Panzerfausts, for example, was Lieutenant Braun's assignment, while I was put in charge of tactical training. The instructions, which had to be limited to studies of terrain and tactical doctrinal instruction, seemed to me, and probably also to the participants, already so senseless that we used instruction hours in class, mainly for exchanging ideas on tactics, and time outdoors in the training area as field trips. In Furtwangen, I got to know a girl who took care of Westphalian children who had been evacuated from the big cities there to Furtwangen. Had I then only suspected what would develop from this for me, I would certainly have avoided meeting her again after the war. I married that girl in 1947, only to be separated in 1953 and divorced in 1955 in Munich. She turned to another man, even while I did everything I could for her. Maybe it's indeed true that fate has planned a certain number of positive but also negative experiences for every person, and we have little choice but to live through it all. From Furtwangen, Lieutenant Braun and I visited our old regiment and the division, which was now awaiting the unavoidable end behind the Rhine at the so-called West Wall. From Furtwangen, I also went to visit my Bavarian Oberst in Berchtesgaden. He had gathered several former members of the 198th Infantry Division around him, or more precisely, they had come and gathered around him. There was our former division adjutant, now wearing the uniform of a Sturmbannführer of the Waffen-SS. I hope he still had his army uniform ready for himself when the Americans came. Then there was the smart Oberleutnant E., who, in his earlier days, was swiftly promoted to Hauptmann, and who, in 1942, in his first heavy battle, suffered a nervous breakdown with such lasting effect that he never again showed up at the front. The third one was that older Hauptmann, whom we found near Uman, completely exhausted, at night in a Russian village. They all led quite a comfortable life. They had sent for their wives and lived until war's end in a fine hotel. The Americans probably then put a quick end to this idyll. My trip to Berchtesgaden took me through Konstanz. When I got off the ferry, I was very surprised to find my strapping Oberstleutnant of the Reserve Training Regiment from Dijon and Auxerre standing on the pier. I had left him a little over a year ago as an Oberleutnant, and now I stood before him, a major, decorated with the Knight's Cross. He feigned his delight about us meeting again so well that I expected an embrace in the Russian or French manner any moment. He stated that he and my former comrades from the training regiment had been very proud of me. I thanked him befittingly and departed, without exhibiting anger, just as I had after my unexpected reunion with the Brazilian coffee bean. The so-called fight to the end for our homeland was a disgraceful, macabre, creeping sickness for the German Wehrmacht, whose bravery, hardiness and unselfishness can never be surpassed by any other army. We should have been spared such an ending, but the military courts threatened with the most dire consequences anyone daring to escape the certain downfall. Parts of my old division were chased all the way into Alpine valleys, until finally the end came on the 8th of May 1945. At the end of March 1945, I was finally transferred to the course for regimental commanders. Just 2 years before this writing, the Federal German Archives in Kornelimünster discovered that there were 2 copies of my orders for the course from March 1945 in their records, so they were kind enough to relinquish one for me to keep. Unbeknownst to me, the orders included an order of merit list drawn up by Army Group G headquarters, which indicated that I had been slated to command a grenadier regiment. Even in March 1945, I took care that my Joseph was allowed to accompany me to the course. Once there, Joseph was highly welcomed, because soldiers of his rank were in perilously short supply. Now, however, he worked not only for me, but also for a major from the General Staff. Originally, the course was planned to begin at the Army Communications School in Halle-on-the-Saale, but that was quickly cancelled. Next, I was to proceed to the tactical training facility at Grafenwohr. Upon my arrival there, a huge Allied bomber squadron was just flattening the last walls of the camp. In spite of the now hopeless situation, the course was continued, though quite sporadically, until the end of the war. Somehow I was still impressed by this unperturbed muddle. Among other things, in the orders to report to the course was a directive that Army Group G is to provide a final evaluation of Major Gross Johann no later than the 1st of May 1945. I am almost sure that it was sent out, but got stuck somewhere at the war's end. The last stop for the course was the garrison for mountain infantry in Mittenwald, and Krien and Wolgau, 2 quaint mountain villages that were nearby. The news announced on the 30th of April that Hitler had been killed during the defence of Berlin was received in different ways by the participants in the course. Astonishingly, the numerous SS officers working in this area reacted especially coolly, a phenomenon which Bundeswehr General Gerd Schmuckel later mentioned in his book Ohne Pauken und Trompeten. We all understood that this was the beginning of a very difficult time for the German people. After Hitler's death became known, the course director, General Major von Larisch, assembled the attendees one more time in the schoolhouse of Krien. What you have learned in the past weeks was certainly not in vain, for just a few years from now there will be a new German army. These were the general's words of farewell. In my reveries I thought of the statement of my little Oberst after the victorious French campaign. He too was correct then by portraying the end of that campaign only as the end of outpost skirmishing. Only a few years later, of course, the words of General von Larisch also became reality. As early as 1948-49, the Western Allies are said to have debated a military contribution by Germany, and to have inquired under what conditions the Germans would be willing to establish a new army. In any case, after his speech, General von Larisch declared the course dissolved. Every participant received several weeks' pay, and if they desired, a rucksack, clothes and heavy mountain boots from the stock of the mountain infantry. A few days earlier, I asked that my Joseph be discharged with his papers completely in order. Without difficulties, he reached his hometown and his especially friendly and big family. His old mother became a dear friend to me in the difficult post-war period. If it wasn't for the Major, our Joseph might not be alive anymore, she said. Being the owner of a farm in Lower Bavaria, she supported me occasionally with plenty of food. Shortly before the Americans moved into Kroon, I withdrew to a comfortable ski lodge in the Karwendel Mountains, accompanied by 2 SS officers and a major. The lodge was owned by Christian Weber, a well-placed party member and president of the Bavarian Motor Racing Club. In the higher mountains, well hidden by the deep snow, the SS men stashed away large stocks of food. Thus we didn't suffer, but actually enjoyed the beautiful start of springtime. Soon we learned that some female SS auxiliaries had fraternized with the Americans right after their arrival. I tried in vain to stop one of the SS officers from visiting his girlfriend in Kroon. He left anyway, but he was expected. In the darkness of night, the well-informed victors shot him on sight, in a meadow in front of the farmhouse in which his girlfriend had found shelter. With certainty, one of her colleagues gave him away to the Americans, and in turn received considerable stocks of groceries and luxury items that had been in storage. The girlfriend of the SS officer was sentenced to a long prison term by an American military court for abetting a fugitive. She served her term in the women's prison in Eikach. I later once paid her a visit in prison. I don't have to talk about the attitude of a large part of the German people, specifically in my case the Bavarian population, towards soldiers just before and after the war. Everybody must have had his own experiences. It happened that when soldiers wanted to take a rest with the farmers, those would cry out, "The Americans are coming," which would cause the soldiers to flee into the mountains. Then the farmers would loot the luggage that was left behind. Regarding the willingness of our population to collaborate with the victors, we don't, by God, have to look down on the French in their days past. One day at breakfast in our lodge, we were discovered by some armed foreigners and they took us away. Fortunately, one of us had gone up to where the butter was kept in the ice and observed our capture. Armed with an automatic pistol, he followed us through thick brush, fired a few rounds into the blue sky, and our paths and the paths of our escorts separated surprisingly quickly. After this, we went back to our hut. It seemed now, however, appropriate to abandon our comfortable shelter at once. We separated and left the lodge by different routes. I had all unnecessary ballast removed from my rucksack, and except for a couple of pairs of socks, filled it to the top with thousands of cigarettes from the SS depot. Later on, this proved exceedingly useful. In the beginning, I hiked along lonely mountain trails until I arrived at Kochel am See, where I deposited all my medals, as well as pertinent documents, with a homeowner whom I trusted. Afterwards, I crossed much of southern Germany, where I could easily evade the Americans, whose checkpoints were only on major roads. I had no problems with food. All I needed to do was to take a pack of cigarettes from my rucksack, which I guarded with my life, and soon I could enjoy a healthy meal at a farmhouse of my choice. Then I arrived in Betzgau, near Kempten im Allgäu, at the house of the mayor, who was until now also the local farmers' leader. I offered my help with harvesting hay, which had already begun. Since I grew up out in the country in my East Prussian homeland, I still had profound knowledge of all types of work related to agriculture. Therefore, I was soon entrusted with activities requiring higher qualifications. Together with the 2 nice daughters of the house, I took care of the milk cows, including my part of the milking, as eventually happened with all leaders, great and small, from any Nazi Party organization. My mayor and ex-farmers leader was one day arrested and imprisoned. What his crime may have been, I don't know. Maybe one could suppose that he indoctrinated National Socialism into the cattle of Betzgau, and I don't mean just the bovine ones. General George S. Patton, Jr., opened the camp doors soon after the war's end and sent all the little fish home and in many cases back to work. He paid for that by losing his post as commanding general of the U.S. Third Army. The mayor's nice wife asked me if I could not at least stay until her husband would come home. In view of subsequent events, maybe this is what I should have done. One late afternoon I went for a swim at a nearby pond. There I was approached by an American officer who assumed I had been a soldier. He asked for my papers. A German-speaking Dutch woman, probably a souvenir the American got in the Netherlands, translated. He was quite a nice young man, and said I must be very exhausted after wandering around so much without sufficient food and shelter for such a long time. Of course I did not tell him that I had been quite well cared for by a local farmer. The American called his driver and ordered him to take me to the army hospital in Kempton. As always, I took my well-stocked rucksack with me, sort of like a beach bag. I picked up my ski pants and the good hiking boots from Mittenwald from my mayor's lady a few days later. In all truth, I could inform her that I now had been taken prisoner. The hospital, under American supervision but German management, served first-rate food from American stocks. After a long time, I could again sleep in an army bed, and with the help of a pass by the German chief physician, everybody could move around freely. 2 weeks later, I was declared healthy and shipped to a prison camp in Biesenhofen, near Kaufbeuren. There, too, I was very lucky because, as a whole, the American troops in that region behaved in a way occupation forces should, that is, according to international law. I had already had a typical experience in Kempten, which was just north of the French sector. One day I had company in my room, a reserved older gentleman. Later I learned that he was a high party official and Secretary of State in some kind of Reich ministry. Apparently he had been warned in time and had moved from the French sector into the nearby American zone of occupation. When the French wanted to pick him up from his hideaway in a farmhouse, he escaped to Kempten. Furious about their failure, the French went to the farmer's wife and threatened to burn down the farmstead if the party official did not immediately return to their zone of occupation. Evidently, he had told his hostess that he had to go to Kempten to the hospital. Unlike me, he really needed medical help. So the scared woman showed up in the hospital and fervently begged her guest to return to the French sector, something he did not show the slightest inclination to do. Being a professional soldier, I did not expect to have problems with anyone, so I accompanied the woman to the American command post and explained to a young officer, who spoke German fluently, what the French were planning to do. Already by this time, one could notice the tension building between the French and the Americans. The Americans, for example, had already had to pressure the French to pull out of Stuttgart by temporarily discontinuing their supply. The Hauptmann drove with the fearful woman to her farmhouse at once, and as I learned a little later, energetically discouraged the French from their plan. Incidentally, I later saw the party official, at a distance, in the camp at Biesenhofen. He was already segregated from the ordinary military prisoners, in a separate compound cordoned by barbed wire. In this camp, fortunately, quite orderly conditions prevailed, unlike many other prison camps, for example, Bad Kreuznach. In our camp, we had tents with straw to sleep on, and simple but adequate food. I met many old acquaintances, even some from my East Prussian peacetime unit, all older by some years and higher ranking than when I saw them last. The day I arrived, the Americans were just in the process of segregating the high party officials from the regular prisoners. Generals and general staff officers were moved the same day into a newly prepared camp across the street. Later on, they were kept in special camps for many months. An officer of the American Guard unit wanted to name me leader of a company of officers. I explained to him that perhaps one of the many administration officials with equal or higher rank would be more suitable, and to my great relief, he agreed. A few days later, I was called into the tent where, after a brief interrogation, if there were no charges against them, everybody was discharged from the Wehrmacht. The Americans were especially suspicious of people who couldn't present their soldier's paybook. At Biesenhofen, almost everyone who had the book and was a soldier in the army, or the Luftwaffe, was discharged at once. The American who questioned me wanted to know if the German cross in gold on my passport photo was not the Golden Party pin. In good conscience and faith, I answered negatively, and I was certain that he knew that anyway. Then he asked me about my attitude towards Hitler. My answer, that I hadn't yet had time to think about it, and that it would probably take too long to do it here and now, seemed to satisfy him. He even responded to my request to give me the pages of my paybook containing the entries of promotions and awards, rather than throwing them into an almost full carton. And, in this informal manner, thereby put an end to my 17 years as a soldier. My years as a professional had left me little time for introspection or reflection. Now, on the precipice of the end of that phase of my life, it occurred to me that soldierly life has two faces, the pompous, pathetic, and the mystical, glorious. I had met many officers who wore the first face, but I had also known so many soldiers and officers who treasured the second. My first experience with that mystical and glorious face of military existence had been as a recruit at Marienburg in West Prussia in 1928. On the occasion of the visit of Wilhelm Groener, the Weimar Republic's Minister of Defense, I participated in a Großer Zapfenstreich, or Grand Tattoo. This ceremony is one of the most impressive in a German soldier's life, and is reserved for occasions of great import. To have one conducted in one's personal honour is one of the highest tributes to which one can aspire. In all garrisons, the Locken was played each night to signal soldiers that it was time to return to their barracks. 15 minutes later, the tattoo was performed. It was routinely played each night by buglers or staff trumpeters, as a signal that all soldiers not on pass or furlough must be in their barracks by the time the last note was played. The Grand Tattoo, however, was something very different. It is practically impossible for anyone who witnesses, much less participates in, a Grand Tattoo to fail to be profoundly moved. It was played by the regimental band, augmented by kettle drums, fifes, and even carillons, and featured an honour company whose flanking files carried flaming torches. Each Grand Tattoo began with a crescendo of rolling drums, then the shrill shriek of fifes, which denoted the Locken. This was followed by the call to evening prayer, signified by the playing of Deutschland über alles, the national anthem, which was, after all, originally a hymn by Haydn. Next, a selection of some of the most stirring German martial tunes was played. I always liked Der Fährberliner Reitermarsch the best, and it was nearly always part of the band's repertoire for a Grand Tattoo. This tune combined the very emotive elements of soldierly pride and melancholy sorrow. Count Moltke, the elder, its creator, must have been a very intuitive and sensitive man to be able to so effectively reflect these fundamental emotions of every soldier's life through the media of rolling drums, skirling fifes, and trumpet fanfares. Behind the ranks of Prussian grenadiers marched the drummers and buglers, and not just to help them keep in step, they would also signal the beginning of an assault. Many a grenadier was sent headlong into hand-to-hand combat by the electrifying bugle and drum call to lower rifle, prepare to attack. This, too, was part of the Grand Tattoo. "Gentlemen, this is a festive moment," one of my East Prussian aristocrat regimental commanders once orated on the occasion of a Grand Tattoo. The terms associated with this event, such as the oath on the colours, a hero's death, field of honour, all these may, out of context, sound like empty phrases, but through centuries they have helped many men in times of strife, and not just on our side, to more easily give their lives for their people and their country. True enough. Yet in this spring of 1945, there would be no Grand Tattoos conducted in honour of the millions of German soldiers who had given their lives during the last 6 years. I received my discharge papers and some money, I think it was 80 Reichsmarks, and was allowed to leave the camp. At that time, the Americans generally behaved extremely arrogantly, but I did not encounter any hateful US soldiers in Biesenhofen. Before one could finally leave the camp, everybody received a checkmark of white oil paint on both pant legs, so I stitched a patch of fabric on each leg of my new ski pants, and the GI giving out the paint marks placed them right there, in accordance with my wishes. The purpose of those marks was hard to understand, but maybe the American commander was a rancher at home and was used to branding cattle before they were let go. After the 8th of May, our market value to the Americans was probably not higher than their livestock at home. That only came to an end when, in 1948, the Russians started to make it clear to the Americans that they intended to be the future king of the hill. Before the discharge ceremony, a pathetically far cry from a Grand Tattoo, I had bundled up my humble belongings and left the camp as an orderly, released civilian. Outside the barbed wire, I took several deep breaths. I survived, I was healthy, I was free. Everything else would fall into place. Never again in my life did I experience independence and freedom as something so beautiful as at that moment. As a Zollfender, I had extended my military service by some unpleasant years, but as of now, it was finally finished. Quite differently from anything I could have imagined in 1928.